The decision no one remembers making. There's a strange thing about the decisions people regret most. In the moment, almost none of them feel like mistakes. The email sent at midnight, driven by a flash of anger. The job accepted because the offer letter arrived on a hard week. The relationship extended past its natural end because being alone felt heavier than being unhappy. None of these felt reckless while they were happening. Each one felt at the time completely reasonable. That's the part most people never examine. We assume bad decisions come from bad thinking, but most of them come from good thinking applied to the wrong question. Instead of asking, what is true here, the mind quietly asks, what will make this feeling go away? And once that substitution happens, almost any choice can be justified. Here's what's easy to miss. Somewhere beneath the noise of daily choices, a small number of people seem to operate by a different standard. Not because they feel less, they feel plenty. But somewhere along the way, they made an agreement with themselves, never spoken aloud, never written down, that certain decisions would not be handed over to whatever emotion happened to be loudest that day. They didn't call it discipline. Most of them couldn't even name it if you asked. It shows up as a kind of quiet delay, a pause before responding, a refusal to decide anything important while upset, exhausted, or flattered. From the outside, it can look like coldness or caution, or even indecision. It isn't any of those things. It's closer to a contract, one made with a future version of themselves who will have to live with today's choice. This is not a story about suppressing emotion. Emotion isn't the enemy here. The people who protect their judgment most carefully are often the ones who feel the most. They've simply learned not to let feeling and deciding happen in the same breath. That distinction, small as it sounds, tends to separate two very different lives. What follows isn't a productivity method or a mindset trick. It's an exploration of something closer to psychology than self-help. The invisible mechanisms that quietly decide whether someone builds trust with themselves over time or slowly erodes it, one reasonable feeling decision at a time. There's a framework buried in all of this, a way of seeing exactly where the break happens between impulse and judgment, and what separates people who catch it from people who don't. It won't be handed over yet. It has to be built, piece by piece, the same way it was discovered, through watching closely what actually happens in the seconds before someone decides. For now, only one thing is worth sitting with. Somewhere in your own life, there's likely a decision you made recently that felt right at the time. The question this audiobook is really asking isn't whether that decision was good or bad. It's whether it was actually yours, or whether something else was deciding for you. There's a particular kind of relief that comes from finally reacting. Something has been building. Frustration, embarrassment, fear. And then, finally, a decision gets made. An email goes out. A resignation gets typed. A boundary gets announced loudly in a moment that guaranteed it would land badly. And for a few seconds afterward, there's relief. The pressure is gone. That relief is real. It's also almost never free. Think of it like a discount at checkout. The emotional decision offers something the rational one doesn't: immediate resolution. No waiting, no sitting with discomfort, no tolerating the unbearable feeling of an unresolved situation. You get to feel better right now. But like most discounts, the real price hasn't disappeared. It's been deferred quietly to a future date, usually with interest. Consider someone who feels disrespected in a meeting and fires back a sharp response on the spot. In the moment, it feels like strength. It feels like finally standing up for themselves. But 3 days later, that same person is managing the fallout, a colleague who now hesitates before collaborating, a reputation for volatility that didn't exist a week earlier, a version of trust that has to be slowly rebuilt through months of consistent, boring reliability. The emotional decision cost far more than the silence would have. This is the part behavioral psychologists have circled for decades without always naming it this way. Humans are wired to overvalue immediate emotional resolution and undervalue delayed cost. It's the same mechanism behind impulsive spending, impulsive eating, impulsive speech. The nervous system doesn't naturally price in next month. It prices in the next 10 seconds. And whatever ends discomfort the fastest tends to feel, falsely, like the correct choice. What makes this dangerous isn't that emotional decisions are always wrong. Sometimes the sharp response is deserved. Sometimes urgency is real. The danger is that the feeling of certainty in the moment is identical, whether the decision is right or wrong. Confidence and correctness are not the same sensation, but they arrive in the body exactly the same way. That's the trap. The body cannot tell the difference between conviction and reaction. Only time can. People who seem to make consistently sound decisions aren't immune to this pull. They've simply learned to recognize the specific texture of an emotional discount when it appears, that seductive, urgent sense that acting right now will fix something. And instead of trusting the urgency, they've trained themselves to treat it as a signal worth questioning rather than obeying. There's a quiet realization hiding underneath all of this, one worth sitting with for a moment. The desire to feel better immediately and the desire to be right later are often pulling in opposite directions. Almost every regretted decision in a person's life sits at that exact intersection, which raises an uncomfortable question. If relief and correctness aren't the same thing, what exactly are people relying on when they say a decision felt right? There's a version of you that exists 6 months from now, dealing with the consequences of a decision you're about to make today. That version doesn't get a vote. They don't get consulted. They simply inherit whatever gets decided in this moment. The resignation letter, the harsh text, the impulsive purchase, the promise made to sound generous in front of others, and they have to live inside it. Most people never think about that future self as a real party in the decision. They think about the decision as something happening only to the present self, the one who's angry right now, tired right now, embarrassed right now. But every choice is really a negotiation between two people who happen to share the same body. One of them is asking to feel better immediately, the other is going to have to clean up whatever's left. This is what could be called the invisible contract. Nobody signs it. Nobody reads the terms out loud, and yet it exists the moment a person begins caring about who they're becoming, not just how they feel today. The agreement is simple, even if it's rarely spoken. I will not make permanent decisions to solve temporary feelings. Most contracts get broken quietly. A man who prides himself on being even-tempered snaps at his business partner during a stressful negotiation and tells himself it was justified this once. A woman who values her independence agrees to a financial arrangement she's uneasy about because saying no in the moment felt harder than saying yes. Neither of these people thinks of themselves as someone who breaks promises, but the promise wasn't made to anyone else. It was made to the future self who now has to manage the damage. Here's the part that goes unnoticed. Trust doesn't only erode between people, it erodes internally too. Every time someone overrides their own better judgment for short-term relief, something subtle shifts, a small, cumulative loss of self-trust. And self-trust, unlike reputation, doesn't announce its decline. It just quietly changes how confidently a person moves through hard decisions later. People who've broken this contract with themselves repeatedly often describe a vague sense of unreliability they can't quite explain. Not because others don't trust them, but because they've stopped fully trusting themselves. The people who seem unusually steady under pressure aren't steadier by nature. They've simply internalized this contract more consistently than most. When a decision arrives wrapped in urgency or emotion, they don't ask, "What do I want right now?" They ask a quieter, less comfortable question. What would the version of me dealing with this in 6 months want me to do? That single reframe, deciding on behalf of someone who doesn't exist yet, turns out to be one of the most reliable predictors of long-term judgment. It's not about suppressing what you feel today. It's about remembering you're not the only one who has to live with the answer, which leaves an open question worth carrying forward. If part of you is always negotiating on behalf of someone who isn't in the room yet, what exactly gives that unseen party enough authority to overrule the one who's standing there feeling everything right now? There's an assumption buried in most people's decision-making that almost never gets questioned. If a choice feels comfortable, it's probably safe. If it feels uncomfortable, something is probably wrong. This assumption is so automatic that most people never notice they're using it. And it happens to be one of the least reliable instincts a person can trust. Comfort was never designed to signal correctness. It was designed to signal familiarity. The nervous system relaxes around what it recognizes. not around what's good for it. Which means the most comfortable option in any given moment is often simply the most familiar one. Not the wisest one, not the healthiest one, just the one requiring the least adjustment. Picture someone who's outgrown their job. The work no longer challenges them, the pay has plateaued, and a part of them has known for over a year that it's time to leave. But every time they imagine leaving, discomfort arrives instantly. Uncertainty about income, the effort of interviewing, the fear of starting over. Staying, by contrast, feels calm, familiar, almost peaceful. So they stay another year, then another. The comfort of staying gets mistaken, quietly, for evidence that staying is right. This is the comfort trap. It doesn't announce itself as fear. It disguises itself as ease. And because ease feels like the absence of a problem, most people never think to question it. There's a reason this pattern is so persistent. Discomfort is the body's way of flagging effort, risk, or change, three things that were genuinely dangerous for most of human history. Deviating from the group, taking an unfamiliar path, challenging an established relationship. These behaviors once carried real survival costs. So the nervous system learned to treat discomfort as a warning sign, regardless of whether the underlying situation was actually threatening or simply unfamiliar. That wiring hasn't updated. It still treats a hard conversation with a business partner the same way it once treated leaving the safety of the tribe. People who consistently make sound long-term decisions have usually stumbled onto a quiet correction for this. They've learned to treat discomfort not as a stop sign, but as a variable worth investigating. Not every uncomfortable choice is correct. Plenty of bad decisions feel uncomfortable too, for good reason. But they've stopped assuming comfort itself is proof of anything. They ask a different question than most people ask. Not, does this feel okay? But, is this comfort coming from safety or from familiarity? Those two things get confused constantly, and the difference between them is almost everything. Safety means the situation is genuinely sound. Familiarity just means the nervous system has stopped flagging it. A relationship that's quietly draining someone can feel comfortable simply because it's known. A financial habit that's slowly limiting someone's future can feel comfortable simply because it's routine, which leads to something worth sitting with. If comfort can't reliably tell the difference between what's safe and what's merely familiar, then the feeling of ease a person gets from staying exactly where they are might be one of the least trustworthy signals they own. And yet for most people, it's the one they trust the most. There's a particular kind of decision that rarely gets recognized as emotional because it doesn't feel like emotion at all. It feels like manners, like consideration, like being a reasonable person. It shows up as agreeing to a deadline that's genuinely unworkable. Taking on a project nobody else wanted simply because refusing felt awkward. Saying yes to dinner, a favor, a commitment. Not because there's a real desire to do it, but because the discomfort of disappointing someone outweighs in that instant the cost of overcommitting. This is the approval reflex, and it may be the most disguised emotional decision there is, precisely because it wears the mask of virtue. Consider a manager asked by a senior executive to take on an unrealistic project timeline. Every instinct tells her the deadline can't be met without cutting corners that will cost more time later. But the executive is watching. The moment feels charged with evaluation, and so she says yes. Not because she's calculated that it's possible, but because saying no in that specific moment, in front of that specific person, felt unbearable. 3 weeks later, the project is behind, the quality has suffered, and she's the one absorbing the consequences of a decision that was never really about the timeline. It was about not wanting to be seen as difficult. What makes the approval reflex so persistent is that it's rooted in something ancient and, for most of human history, entirely rational. Being disliked by the group once carried real consequences: exclusion, loss of resources, loss of protection. The nervous system still treats social disapproval as a threat roughly comparable to physical danger, even when the modern stakes are nothing like that. A raised eyebrow from a boss doesn't threaten survival, but the body doesn't always know that. The result is a decision-making pattern that prioritizes the emotional temperature of the room over the actual merits of the choice. And because it happens in real time, in front of other people, It's one of the hardest patterns to interrupt. There's no private moment to pause in. The pressure to respond is immediate and social. This is why the people who protect their judgment most carefully share an unusual habit. They try never to make significant decisions while being watched. Not because privacy makes the decision easier, but because it removes one specific variable, the desire to be perceived a certain way, that has nothing to do with whether the decision is actually sound. A commitment made in private, away from anyone's gaze, has a much higher chance of reflecting what someone actually believes is right, rather than what will make them look good, agreeable, or easy to work with in that instant. It's worth noticing how often the phrase "I didn't want to make a scene" or "I didn't want to seem difficult" appears right before a decision someone later regrets. That phrase is rarely about the decision itself. It's about audience, which raises a question worth carrying into the next idea. If so many decisions are secretly shaped by who's watching, what happens to a person's judgment in the moments when the pressure isn't social at all, when the only thing pushing them to act immediately is time itself? There's a sentence that precedes an enormous number of regretted decisions, and it rarely gets questioned in the moment it's spoken. I had to decide right now. Almost every account of a decision gone wrong includes some version of this. The offer that would expire by end of day, the opportunity that felt like it couldn't wait, the argument that seemed to demand an immediate response. In hindsight, most of these deadlines turn out to be far softer than they felt, negotiable, exaggerated, or entirely self-imposed. But in the moment, urgency doesn't feel like a story. It feels like fact. This matters because urgency does something very specific to judgment. It shrinks the amount of time available for the slower, more deliberate parts of the mind to engage. Fast thinking is instinctive, emotional, pattern-based. Slow thinking is careful, comparative, weighs trade-offs. Urgency doesn't eliminate slow thinking. It simply runs out the clock before it can finish its work, which means most decisions made under manufactured urgency aren't actually worse because the person is less capable. They're worse because only half the decision-making process got to participate. Consider a common scenario in negotiations. A seller mentions almost casually that another buyer is interested. Nothing about the underlying value of what's being sold has changed, but suddenly the buyer's timeline compresses from weeks to minutes, and a purchase that deserved careful comparison gets made on the spot. The scarcity wasn't necessarily false, but its function was the same either way. It borrowed time away from judgment and handed it to instinct. What's important to notice is that urgency doesn't always come from someone else. Often it's self-generated. A person convinces themselves a decision must be made tonight, this week, before they lose their nerve, when in reality, almost nothing about the situation requires that speed. The anxious mind manufactures its own deadlines because sitting with an unresolved decision is uncomfortable, and urgency offers an exit from that discomfort disguised as decisiveness. This is where a small, almost boring habit separates people who protect their judgment from those who don't. When faced with pressure to decide immediately, they ask one question before anything else: is this deadline real, or does it just feel real? Real deadlines exist. Flights leave. Offers do expire. Some windows genuinely close. But far more often than people expect, the deadline turns out to be flexible, negotiable, or invented entirely by the anxious need to be done deciding. There's a quiet discipline in simply asking for more time, even a single day, even an hour. Not because more time guarantees a better decision, but because it interrupts the illusion that speed and importance are the same thing. Most decisions that genuinely matter can survive a short delay, the ones that can't usually announce themselves clearly. And those are rare, which brings something into focus that's been building across every idea so far. Emotional discounts, broken contracts, false comfort, the need for approval, invented urgency. None of these are separate problems. They're the same pattern wearing different disguises, which raises the real question underneath all of it. If feelings can't be trusted to signal what's true, what can a person actually rely on when it's time to decide? There's a question most people never think to ask before making a decision, and it's more powerful than almost any other filter available. Not, what do I want? Not, what will make this easier? But, Who does this make me? Every choice examined closely enough is really a small vote. Not a vote for an outcome, but a vote for a version of self. Send the sharp email, and you cast a vote for being someone who reacts. Stay silent and think it through, and you cast a vote for being someone who absorbs pressure without transferring it. Neither vote is permanent on its own. One email doesn't define a person, but votes accumulate. And identity, it turns out, isn't something people simply have. It's something they keep re-electing decision by decision, often without realizing an election is happening at all. This reframes everything explored so far. The emotional discount, the broken contract with the future self, the comfort trap, the approval reflex, the urgency illusion. Each of these is really the same event viewed from a different angle. In every case, a person is being asked to trade a small piece of their identity for a moment of relief. And because each individual trade feels so small, so justified, so understandable given the circumstances, the cost is almost invisible in the moment it's paid. Consider two people facing the identical situation. A business partner who has quietly failed to deliver on a promise. One responds from frustration, firing off a message that damages the relationship beyond repair. The other pauses, allows the frustration to pass, and responds a day later with the same core message, delivered with enough control that the relationship survives and the boundary still gets communicated. Both people were equally frustrated. The difference wasn't the emotion, it was which version of themselves got to answer. This is where the deepest form of self-trust actually gets built, not through big dramatic acts of willpower, but through thousands of small moments where someone quietly overrides an impulse in favor of who they intend to become. Psychologists sometimes describe this as identity-based decision-making, and it explains something that pure willpower never fully could. People who successfully change long-term patterns rarely do it by gritting their teeth through temptation. They do it by shifting the question from "should I do this" to "does someone like me do this?" The second question requires far less willpower because it isn't fighting the impulse directly. It's simply no longer relevant to who they've decided they are. There's something quietly freeing in this. It means the goal was never to eliminate emotion or to become someone who doesn't feel frustration, fear, temptation, or urgency. Those will always show up. The goal is simpler and, in some ways, more achievable. To make sure emotion gets heard, but identity gets the final vote. Every chapter so far has pointed toward the same hidden structure, approached from different directions. What remains is to see all of it together, not as 6 separate lessons, but as one continuous mechanism operating underneath every decision a person will ever make. Step back far enough, and everything explored so far starts to look less like 6 separate ideas and more like a single mechanism, viewed from 6 different angles. That mechanism has a shape. Once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere, in your own decisions, in the decisions of people you admire. In the exact moment things go quietly wrong for people who otherwise seem competent and composed. Call it the invisible contract model. It works as 4 checkpoints, sitting between the moment an impulse arrives and the moment a decision gets made. Most people never know these checkpoints exist, because most decisions move through all 4 in a fraction of a second, unexamined. The first checkpoint is the discount check. Before acting, the question is simple. Is this decision offering me relief right now at a cost I haven't priced in yet? This is the emotional discount from the first chapter, the sharp email, the impulsive resignation, the reaction that trades a future cost for a present feeling. Catching it doesn't mean refusing to ever act quickly. It means noticing when speed is being used to avoid discomfort rather than to seize a genuine opportunity. The second checkpoint is the future self-check. This is the contract itself, pausing long enough to ask what the version of you living with this decision in 6 months would want you to do right now. It's a small mental move, almost embarrassingly simple, and yet it reliably interrupts decisions made purely for the benefit of the present moment. The third checkpoint is the comfort audit. Rather than treating ease as proof of correctness, this step asks whether the comfort in front of you is coming from genuine safety or from mere familiarity, and whether the discomfort of the alternative is a warning sign or simply the unfamiliar shape of growth. This single distinction dismantles both the comfort trap and much of what disguises itself as caution. The fourth checkpoint is the audience check. Before deciding, ask honestly whether this choice is being shaped by what's actually true or by who happens to be watching. Decisions made to manage how you're perceived rarely hold up as well as decisions made in private, where approval isn't on the table. These 4 checkpoints don't need to be run formally, like a checklist pulled out before every decision. In people who've internalized this model, they operate more like a reflex, a slight hesitation before responding, a pause that feels almost imperceptible from the outside but changes everything about what happens next. That pause is where urgency gets tested, where the emotional discount gets noticed, where identity, not impulse, gets the final vote. What ties all 4 checkpoints together is the single idea running underneath this entire audiobook. Judgment isn't the absence of feeling. It's the presence of a system feeling has to pass through before it's allowed to become action. The people who seem to consistently make sound decisions aren't calmer by nature, or less emotional, or immune to pressure. They've simply built, often without ever naming it, a working version of this exact model, 1 checkpoint at a time, through years of small corrections most people never see. What remains now is simpler than it might sound. Not to memorize 4 steps, but to understand what happens when someone actually starts living by them. Go back to the beginning of this audiobook. The email sent at midnight, the offer accepted on a hard week, the relationship extended past its natural end. Each one felt reasonable in the moment. That was never in question. What's clearer now is why. None of those decisions failed because the person making them was foolish or weak or lacking some trait that more successful people happen to have. They failed because, in that specific moment, feeling was allowed to answer a question that belonged to judgment. The relief of the emotional discount, the absence of a future self at the table, comfort mistaken for safety, approval mistaken for correctness, urgency mistaken for truth. Different disguises, same event, happening quietly inside almost everyone, almost every day. The people this audiobook has been circling, the ones who seem to move through hard decisions with unusual steadiness, were never chosen for this. They didn't start with more discipline, more clarity, or less emotion than anyone else. They simply started noticing the checkpoints. And once noticed, a checkpoint is very hard to unsee. That's the real transformation this book has been pointing toward. Not a technique, not a framework to memorize and apply under pressure. A different relationship with the small pause that exists between feeling something and acting on it. This is worth being honest about. None of this makes emotions smaller or life easier, or decisions painless. The frustration will still arrive. The urgency will still feel real. The desire for approval will still tighten the chest in the exact moment a hard truth needs to be spoken. What changes isn't the intensity of what's felt. What changes is who gets the final vote once it has been felt. There's a specific kind of confidence that comes from this, quieter than the confidence people usually picture, and far more durable. It isn't the confidence of always knowing the right answer. It's the confidence of knowing that whatever answer arrives, it will have passed through something before becoming action. That a version of you further down the line won't be left cleaning up a decision made by someone who was simply trying to feel better for 10 minutes. This is the invisible contract finally named. Not a promise to be perfect, not a promise to never feel pulled toward the fast relief of an emotional decision, just a promise, kept quietly and repeatedly, to let judgment, not the loudest feeling in the room, decide who you become next. The next time a decision arrives wrapped in urgency, wrapped in comfort, wrapped in the desire to be seen a certain way, there will be a pause, small, almost invisible to anyone watching. But inside that pause is the entire difference between a life shaped by whatever felt easiest in the moment and a life shaped by someone who, decision after decision, quietly kept their word.